Hello, I am Punya Mishra. I'm a professor at Michigan State University. You can contact me, find out more about me by going to my website, sending me email, or using Facebook, Twitter, and so on. I want to start by thanking all of you for inviting me to this conference virtually. I would have much preferred to be there in person, but I know this is difficult with time and travel and all that. So I'm just grateful that I got this chance to talk to all of you. Let me start by telling you a little bit about myself and my dream. And actually, surprisingly enough, my dream is to be on The Simpsons, which you haven't seen The Simpsons. It's a very funny cartoon show on television, and that's what I would look like if I were on The Simpsons. I would also like to mention my friend and colleague with whom I have done a lot of my work. This is Matthew Kaler. This is what he looks like. As you can see, he's a very handsome man with sunglasses and even without sunglasses. We are both professors at Michigan State University, and we spend a lot of our time thinking and talking about technology and education and what exactly teachers need to know. When we think about the fact that we now are in the 21st century, and so there's a lot of discussion about what 21st century learning should be. A couple of years ago, I was asked to be a part of a panel which set up this report for the American Association of Colleges of Teacher Education on 21st century knowledge and skills in educator preparation. Specifically, we came up with a whole bunch of guidelines and thoughts. And the one that I want to highlight here is the one that says that teachers and administrators will possess, teach, and assess 21st century skills and knowledge. And I have to confess that even though I was a part of this panel, there was a part of me which was sort of wondering what is this thing that we call 21st century learning. And so, like any good, respectable academic, I went to Google and I did a search and I got 23 million hits in 0.23 seconds. And one of the things that kept popping up was technology. So, for instance, here's a description of what this person called the 21st century kid, that they have a cell phone in one ear, an iPod in the other. BlackBerry is now a verb, spam is not canned meat. And so there was this huge emphasis on technology. This description comes from 21stcenturyschools.com website. If you go look at what teachers need to know, you'd find that there's a lot of discussion of wikis and blogs, of social networking, Web 2.0, Google Docs, all that kind of stuff. So one thing that I took away from this discussion is that 21st century learning will depend greatly on early 21st century technology. Because we are at the early point of the 21st century, we are just 12 years into the 21st century. So the idea is that the whole of 21st century learning will depend on technologies that are prevalent today. So that let me ask a question. So I said, let's go back to the future and see what would 20th century technology learning look like if we based it on the technologies of 1912. So I went and did a Google search, and these are some of the things that I came up with. And the one that struck me was crayons, because I thought crayons are a very good educational technology, and they are still being used in classrooms. They are incredibly, colorful, bright, and kindergartners can use it, and adults can use it. But at some level, if you think about it, that if you think that these objects would become the future of 20th century learning, I thought that was kind of strange. So we are sort of doing the same thing here when we are taking technologies that came up in 2005 or 2010 and say all of 21st century technology or learning is going to depend on these tools. So clearly we have to think about 21st century learning, but have to go beyond sort of the newest, shiniest thing. Now, this is really important for us to remember, because otherwise we get sucked into whatever the newest and the latest tool is and keep focusing on that. Okay? However, that said, we must also recognize that the world has fundamentally changed. I mean, a world that my kids, I have a 16-year-old son, a 13-year-old daughter, that they live in looks something like this. Right? And I think it's really important for us to think and ask, what does it mean for somebody to live in a world where Google Earth is available at your fingertips, where MapQuest is available, where there are all these different kinds of video games like World of Warcraft or SimLife. So what does that mean for us? And then if you add to that the social media, you realize that you're looking at a very different kind of a world that our kids are growing up in. Just look at some of the changes that have been happening in the world. Who would have thought that Facebook and Twitter would be a part of this great transformation that's happening, that we call the Arab Spring. So that's a really powerful thing. And then when I think about when I was growing up and how information came to me, I would have to take a bus. I was growing up in New Delhi in India. I would take a bus and go all the way across the city to like the two good libraries that were there and pick up two bags of books and come back. And and I had to go back there again in a month to do that. And so information sort of came at me like this. Now, when we think, so I had to actually actively go out and seek information. Now, when you think about it, the situation is something like this, where the information is coming at us, while we have to develop filters and ways of making sense of this information. So, given all this change that's happening and this flood of information that's coming, it's not surprising that teachers sometimes can feel like this, right? This is an actual sculpture at Twente University in Netherlands, and I thought it was funny, and I thought I can include it in my presentation. So what this means for us that we need to rethink the kind of role that technology is playing in our lives, that the role that technology is playing or can play in the educational process. So one of the important things to understand is that technology does certain key things in the educational process. Firstly, technology changes how we teach. So for instance, one of the biggest innovations of technology in our lifetime as educators is this one. The fact that anybody in the world with access to the internet now has access to the greatest collection of information the world has ever seen. Never before in the entire human history has this been possible. Now, one can argue that the information on Google is not always right, that websites can be biased and they can be wrong, but that just means that what we teach our students has to change because that's the world they live in. So they have to develop skills which are more around critical thinking, information, passing judgment on information, figuring out biases, and so on. So when I'm with my kids, for instance, they come and ask me some question, and I have formed this what I call Punya's 23rd law of parenting. And basically what this says is that in this world where facts are available at your fingertips, that don't come to me for facts. And I say, for facts, go to Google, but for wisdom, come to me. And I think that sort of indicates the changing role of the parent or the teacher or the mentor in this world. If you combine Google with something like MIT OpenCourseWare, with the availability of videos like, let's say, Khan Academy or other videos, with Web 2.0 content, with increasing classrooms where they're allowing kids to bring their own devices to school, the growth of online learning, both at school level as well as university level. This is the chart for up till 2009 for the growth of online learning in K-12 schools in the US. Then you look at something like what are known as these MOOCs, which is massively online open courses through Coursera, Udacity. You realize that technology has fundamentally changed how we teach. And it is really important for us as educators to factor that in. But technology doesn't change how we teach, it also changes what we teach. If you look at any aspect, anything that we do as humans, whether it's mathematics or art or science, physics, engineering, music, all of these things have fundamentally changed due to technology. Mathematicians now use computers to do simulations. Artists use computers to create art, graphic design, music, so on and so forth. Physics has changed. Engineering has changed. Political science has changed. We are going through an election in the US right now, and you today, or any person today, has access to poll information, data, all kinds of things, which was not available to except to the elite at just a few years ago. So that fundamentally changes things. My favorite example of how technology changes things is this one, the periodic table of elements. And if you see the periodic table of elements, you'll see that a certain group of elements have been placed outside of the table. And actually, a better representation of the table would be this one. But the one that we typically see in textbooks is this. In fact, there's research to show that this is difficult for students to understand because they have to jump between these two tables and they get confused in that process. And turns out that the main reason why the table is represented this way is because it fits better on a page. Otherwise, you'd have to make the page longer or do something like that. So this is a just a simple but very telling example of how technology changes how we represent knowledge. Now, it turns out that there are hundreds of different representations of the table that chemists have made. And now, with computers and tablet PCs or whatever, you now have an opportunity to allow students to play and interact with these different representations because they are not constrained by the dimension of the page anymore. So the two things that what technology does is, one, it changes how we teach, it changes what we teach. Now, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. Okay, so this happens within specific contexts. So you might be in a classroom where it's a one-on-one classroom where every child has a laptop. That's a very different context than this classroom in India where kids are sharing a computer where internet access may or may not be available, which is a very different context from this classroom in the US where young kids have access to these tablet devices which they can walk around with, that they can hold up and take pictures, they can shoot video with it, they can annotate text and so on. So the contextual things matter a lot. Context matters in other ways too. For instance, in the state of Missouri recently banned student friendships on Facebook, student-teacher friendships on Facebook. Now I see this as a really weird, strange thing to do. Luckily, the judge overruled it. But that changes the context within which we can teach. For instance, this example of students in Denmark allowed full access to the internet during exams. It changes the kinds of questions you can ask. You can no longer ask factual questions because students would be able to look that up online. So you have to ask questions, as this report said, what, how, and why kinds of questions. Questions that require judgment, questions that require interpretation, questions that require thinking and critical thinking, right? So what does all this mean? So we have talked about what we teach, how we teach, and technology. But these things should not be seen in isolation from each other, and you should actually look at it in terms of that how they overlap with each other. So this is the idea that good teaching always brings together technology, pedagogy, and content. And this was the idea that we wrote about back in 2006. And when we wrote about it, we called it the TPCK framework. The idea that technology, pedagogy, and content, that teachers need to have knowledge of all three of these, and most importantly, how these three integrate with each other. Now, this was really hard to pronounce, so we decided to call it the TPACK framework because that's easier to say. So technology, pedagogy, and content knowledge. Another way of thinking about it is as if it's a total package for the kinds of knowledge that teachers need to have. The total package, which includes something that needs to be taught, that's the content, how that pedagogy is to happen, and how those two connect with the technology. Because as I said before, technology changes not only how we teach, but also what we teach. One of the things to emphasize here is that when we talk about technology, we don't necessarily mean the latest digital technologies, because technology could be paper and pencil, technology could be a whiteboard, technology could be a pen. Those are also technologies. So we argue that whether it's a chalk or it's a computer or it's the web, teaching has always been about TPACK. I want to give you a little bit of history on how this idea came forth, how we came up with this idea. We were teaching these courses, which we call Learning Technology by Design, and we had some faculty members who were part of that courses who wanted to, let's say, develop an online course, and they worked with a group of students. So you had the faculty member working with a team of students to develop an online course, right? And so we would ask them to prototype a section of the course, we'd ask them to pilot it, we'd ask them to redesign a section of the course. So these were all very hands-on, and then they would go back through that process, recycle through, and go back and prototype another section. And what we were doing at that time is that we were collecting data on this process. So we were collecting data and looking at what was actually going on through this process. What we found is that at the beginning of the term, faculty, I'm sorry, the slides are going a little off. Okay, so the faculty would be experts on the content. They would have some knowledge of pedagogy. The students would have some knowledge of pedagogy, but would not necessarily be experts in content, and they would have a significant sort of understanding of the technology. And that led us to think that, and as we looked at this process over time, we realized that these kinds of knowledge which were separate in different people were actually getting integrated in people's heads. So the first round of data analysis that we did, we wanted to actually talk about it in terms of technology, pedagogy, and content, and the kinds of representations that we create of this. So our early writing actually showed it in a tetrahedral kind of model. But what we found from our data that representations as a category did not work. So this was a case where the data actually pushed us to drop that and to think about it more in terms of a triangle. And so some of our later publications actually have this as a representational scheme. But the problem with this is that if you look at the lines that join these circles, you have a circle which represents knowledge and then a line which also represents knowledge, which does not make sense. So finally, we came up with a representation which is sort of close to what we use today, which presented them as three circles. This way, a circle would represent content, pedagogy, and technology, and the overlaps between them would represent, let's say, between C and P would represent pedagogical content knowledge, which was sort of Schulman's idea. And so we were very inspired by Schulman's work in this area as well. The key article that we wrote was in 2006. This led to a handbook of the AACTE. The original article is now one of the most cited articles in the educational technology literature, with over 1,200 citations in Google Scholar. It has also become the foundation for a lot of work at different organizations across both the country and internationally. There are over 200 articles related to TPACK in database that we maintain, over 20 dissertations, the nation of Australia using it to redesign the teacher education program, and so on and so forth. If you want to know more about it, I would recommend going to tpack.org, which gives a lot of resources for learning more about TPACK and keeping up and current with what's going on. One of the things that I want to talk a little bit about is what doesn't work when we think about technology integration. One thing is clear that if we have teacher training programs or teacher professional development programs which look at these as being separate from each other, it does not work. If you give teachers a workshop on developing a wiki and it does not connect with how they think about their content, how they think about their pedagogy, that knowledge will become inert knowledge and will not be used. What we have found what works is allowing teachers to explore these technologies within the context of their own teaching, within the context of the content that they need to cover. And that is really important. But I want to also, before I go as I go on, want to emphasize that using technology in teaching is not a very straightforward process. That really requires you to be creative and break out of the box, and what we call sort of the transformative aspects of using technology. Because technology can fundamentally change how we represent information, how we allow for students to engage with each other and the content. So for the longest time, we talked about things like using technology. There's enough research to show that if teachers just use technology, they do not actually, even if they use technology in their personal lives, they do not use it in their teaching. So we moved on to the next phase, which we call technology integration. That how can we take technology and integrate it in the process that they're using today. However, what we like to push for, what we would like to see is what we call innovation with technology in the arena of teaching. So which means we take technology and use it ways that allow for its power and its potential for students to engage with content, for students to engage with each other, for new forms of pedagogy. And we argue that technology can help us see, but only if we see technology the right way. I want to give three quick examples of this. The first one is a group of students in Italy who computed the distance to the moon through using freely available data. That's the conversation between mission control and people on the spaceship. And those MP3s are freely available. If you listen to those MP3s, you'll find there is a faint echo of when somebody says something. So, for instance, when Neil Armstrong says the eagle has landed, if you listen carefully, you'll hear the word landed very faintly all over again. So they took that and they put it in a software called Audacity, which is actually a photo recording tool, but it allowed them to zoom in and look at the waveforms and actually determine what the difference was between the actual voice and the echo. And once they did that, they could then multiply that by the speed of light, divide it by 2 because it goes to the moon and comes back, and actually compute the distance to the moon. And I think that's a very, very interesting example because it's very creative. It doesn't use very fancy toys and tools, but it requires a very thoughtful and creative teacher to think about a software like Audacity as being a a tool for data analysis. The next example, this one is a question I very often get, is something like, can online teaching or learning be as good as face-to-face learning? And that is a really frustrating question to me, because my response is something like this. And what I like to do is actually turn the question on its head and say, can face-to-face learning be as good as online? Because I say, imagine if we had online as being the standard, and then somebody would come to us and say, oh, this online, I have this new innovative idea. Why don't we get everybody together in one room and lock them up there and have them talk to each other only for 3 hours a week? And that's where all the learning is going to happen. And so we would be like, that's weird. Learning can happen anytime, because you can log in, you can talk to each other anytime you want, you can send messages, you can do video. But we'd be like, no. So the point being is that it's not that face-to-face is better or online is better. It's just that both have different strengths and weaknesses. So in one of my online classes, for instance, I have my students, the first thing they do when they come into class is that they are given a magic trick. And the magic trick is where the computer actually figures out which card they have been thinking about. And then I ask them, how did the computer figure it out? Now, if I ask this in an audience and somebody gave in a classroom and somebody gave the answer, then everybody else would know the answer. But in an online classroom, what I can do is I can have people give the answer, but they cannot see what other people have written before them. Okay? So which means that now everybody has to work harder to figure it out. So that way these online discussions become very different from what happens in a face-to-face classroom. So this is an affordance of the online world that's not possible in the face-to-face world. So again, the point is this better or that better? It's rather that it depends on what it is that we want to do. So again, it depends on the content, it depends on the pedagogy and how the technology interacts with it. Final example from mathematics. These are these wonderful little apps called dynagraphs, which allow you to sort of almost kinesthetically and viscerally understand mathematics, which is a very different way of thinking about mathematics than just drawing lines on a curve, because these things move as you manipulate them in very rich and powerful ways. Some of the newer tools that are coming up, such as the Kinect, which goes with the Xbox, there are people now who are creating some fantastic software which allow you to sort of move away and from a Kinect at different speeds and sort of physically embody mathematical equations and so on. So the big thing I would like us to ask ourselves is, what do these examples tell us? Would this have been possible 100 years ago? Would this have been possible 10 years ago? Would this have been even possible 5 years ago? So the question then is, what will be possible 5 years from now? And I think this is what it comes to the crux for the teacher, is what I call the importance of creativity. Because these tools and technologies are coming at us at a really fast rate. So teachers need to be extremely nimble and flexible in their thinking. That's where the technology, pedagogy, and content can come together in the kinds of things that they do. William James has very famously said that psychology is a science and teaching is an art. And I think that, as an educational psychologist, I'm trained as an educational psychologist, and I value the work that educational psychologists do. But I also understand that going from the psychology of knowledge of learning sciences to the actual practice in the classroom is an art. And the part that William James said further is that the sciences never generate arts directly out of themselves. An intermediary inventive mind makes the application using originality. And I think this is William James telling us that creativity is incredibly important as we go from the subject matter that we have to teach, the techniques that we have to teaching, and these new tools and technologies that allow us both to represent that knowledge in new ways, as well as connect with each other in different and new ways, and learn in different and new ways. So finally, I make this argument for what I call deep play, which is this sort of not a superficial kind of play that like you're playing a video game, but that seeks to construct new ways of seeing the world, new approaches to using technologies to develop creative pedagogical solutions. So with that, thank you very much. Again, this is my contact information. You can go to my website, you can drop me an email, or get in touch with me through any of these social networking and other sites. And with that, I wish you goodbye, and I hope all of you have a wonderful conference. And I look forward to hearing from you about how things went and so on. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.